If you've been on YouTube for more than 3 minutes, you'll probably have seen a video or two centered around Sonic. He gets talked about quite a bit online, whether it be in criticism or defense of him or his games. There's always a lot of Sonic talk going around, but one thing that doesn't get talked about all that much are the 8-bit entries in the series. Shortly after the release of the Game Boy, Sega came out with this gigantic monstrosity, and what better way to boost sales than to throw their spiky blue cash cow onto the system. Despite the success of the home console games, Sonic's outings on the Game Gear don't seem to be remembered in the same light as Mario's were on the Game Boy, much less talked about at all. So today, we're going to take a look at every Sonic game that's available on the Game Gear. So, the first Sonic game released for the Game Gear was titled Sonic the Hedgehog, but despite sharing the same name as its 16-bit cousin, it's not at all the same game. It shares some of the same zone names and has similar level assets, but save for Green Hill Zone, everything is different, even the music. The stage designs are completely different, and I actually think I like the Game Gear version soundtrack better. The Game Gear and Master System sound like garbage, and nothing beats the Genesis sound chip, but I actually think the compositions here are more catchy. That being said, I think I overall like this game better than actual Sonic 1. Not that that's saying much. Spoiler, I don't like Sonic 1. I didn't need to play through the whole game for the video, but I found myself wanting to actually finish it, so I did. The game seems like it should suffer from screen crunch considering the hardware that it's on, but for the most part, I found no real issues with seeing what's in front of me. The controls were a little sloppy, but overall it plays well and it's a pretty fun time. The only issue I kind of had was in Skybase Act 1, you have to platform around all these periodically flashing electric currents, and it was getting pretty frustrating. Other than that, I have no real complaints. This one gets a pass. Sonic 2, on the other hand, does not get a pass. I had this game when I was a kid, and I hated it then just as much as I hate it now. Now, Sonic 2, the Genesis version, is my favorite video game of all time. I never went into this game thinking it would live up to the standard that I hold that game to, but this doesn't even come remotely close. Forget everything I said about the lack of screen crunch in Sonic 1, this one is the complete opposite. You can just tell from the start of the game that something is just off. Instead of the friendly, green, inviting scenery typical of a first Sonic stage, you get this poopy, dull background with set pieces made of cinder blocks and steel. The music is also, despite not being fitting for a first stage, totally fitting for the ugly setting we're abruptly thrown into. The controls in this game are way touchier. It's extremely difficult to see what's in front of you, so I wouldn't even recommend running at full speed, and this is the first time I've ever actually beaten the first boss because, as a kid, I couldn't get a hold of the slippery controls at all. My favorite part of Sonic 2 for Game Gear is how the game just throws random mechanics at you that aren't explained and don't work. Take this hang glider, for example. It feels like it should control like the cape in Mario World, but it doesn't. I tried like 50 times, and I still can't figure out how you're supposed to use this thing. It straight up just feels bad. The game also throws you into this one section where there's a bunch of clouds, and some of them are platforms, but some aren't. But they all look the same, and there's no way to know which ones have collision and which don't. This is a mess. So this one's probably my favorite. It's called Sonic Chaos, and in this one, you can actually play as Tails, so we're doing that. Sonic Chaos is on the easier side, like the way easier side, but for some reason ramps up in difficulty like halfway through the game. It's still relatively easy, but the difficulty spike was pretty jarring for me, just from like a pacing perspective. The music in this one isn't what I'd call amazing, but it's relatively catchy and totally inoffensive. The stages are all pretty well designed, and everything is wholly original for this game, which is pretty cool to see since this one doesn't have a 16-bit counterpart to be juxtaposed against. The controls are also way better than the first two games. There's also a lot more loops and springs in this one, so the overall speed is more in line with what you'd expect from a console title. If you're gonna play any game I talk about in this video, play this one. Alright, so I guess this technically counts despite it not including Sonic and really just being a reskin of another game, but Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine is a reskin of Puyo Puyo featuring, for some reason, the version of Dr. Robotnik and the Badniks from the Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog cartoon. I never really understood why they went with those designs and not the ones from the actual games, and that was always strange to me. This is basically just a handheld port of the Genesis game. It's really hard to mess this one up. It's Puyo Puyo. It's super fun. I'm super not good at it. This game does have a training/tutorial mode though, so that's kinda neat. At the end of the day though, it's just Puyo Puyo with a Sonic coat of paint. If you're a fan of Puyo Puyo, this is worth a play. The music isn't great though. When I was a kid, I used to pop Sonic Spinball into my Genesis all the time. The game wasn't very good, but the music in the first stage was super catchy and I liked the concept of the game. So I'd turn it on, play till I inevitably got a game over on the first stage, and proceeded to take the game out and play Sonic 2. It wasn't until only a few years ago that I found out there was actually a port of Sonic Spinball for the Game Gear. It's terrible. The original version already didn't control super great and felt kinda slow, but this one? Oh, this is bad. All the physics just feel very wrong, and collision feels super weird too. It's hard to explain in words, but Sonic just doesn't do what I expect him to do. The pinball physics just feel super finicky, and the frame rate seems weird as well. The music isn't good either, and all the scenery isn't interesting to look at since most of the detail they put into level assets in the console version have been pretty much stripped. This one belongs in the big old dumpster. So here's a game we never actually got in America. It's called Sonic Drift, and it's basically Sega going, uh-oh, people really like Mario Kart, what do we do? Better make a subpar racing game with most of the fun aspects of Mario Kart absent and shove it onto our handheld system. That'll stick it to Nintendo. This is one of those retro-style racers. You know, not the Mode 7 Super Nintendo kind, like the NES Rad Racer kind, only not very good. There's only 4 racers to choose from: Sonic, Tails, Eggman, and Amy, and the amount of courses is really limited. The big issue here is that because the character portraits and map take up literally half the screen, it leaves almost no room left for the road ahead of you to be visible. So it's basically the same concept as screen crunch in a platformer. It's hard to react to a thing that you don't even see coming. Making the map smaller might have fixed this problem, but maybe the Game Gear couldn't handle rendering the race at almost full screen and it was actually intentional. Who knows? Either way, I feel like this should have been a Genesis title. The game isn't completely terrible, but it's not great. Sonic Triple Trouble is the 4th Sonic platformer to come to the handheld. It features Knuckles, but you can't actually play as him. You can, however, play as either Sonic or Tails with a mean case of cystic acne. This one doesn't live up to Sonic Chaos at all. It isn't terrible, but it's not great. The screen crunch is back again with this one, though the sprite work does look noticeably better. The game is overall pretty easy, save for the stupid water level, which isn't exactly super difficult, but it's pretty frustrating and annoying. Although, this is where the floating bubble mechanic from Sonic Mania came from, so that's kinda neat. This isn't as badly designed as Sonic 2, but it's not as standout as Sonic 1 or Chaos. It's just very middle of the road with some frustrating parts towards the end of the game. It took me a little over an hour to beat, but if I were you, I'd just pass this one by entirely. So this one we actually did get, and it's very weird considering we got Sonic Drift 2, yet they didn't change the title for the US market and nobody asked any questions. Alright, so if you're a Mario Kart fan, you know what Mario Kart sequels are like, and this is in the same vein. Almost double the available characters, more courses, the music is better, the sprite work is a little better, the controls feel a little tighter in my opinion, but here we are with the same screen crunch issues. I pretty much had to learn to manage by glancing at the map constantly so I knew when turns were coming up, so I'd know exactly when to drift, since the arrow signs don't really give you enough notice. This is overall a nice little upgrade. It didn't completely reinvent the game, and I'm pretty sure it's running off the same engine as the first game, but it's competent enough to check out. I still think this should have been a console title though. Only took him another 15 years! Alright, I couldn't play this hunk of crap for more than 8 minutes. I'm not kidding. The total time of the video file for my footage is 8 minutes and 56 seconds. This is another Japan-exclusive title. It's called Tail Sky Patrol, and it's this sort of weird amalgamate of a side-scrolling shooter and a platformer. I don't know what you'd even call this. Touching almost anything with Tails' actual sprite makes you lose a life, and the hitboxes are so weird. Half the time I can't believe I actually made contact with anything. The first stage is a training ground, and I honestly thought I wasn't even gonna get past it. I finally did though, but that's all she wrote. I couldn't beat the second, well, actually the first stage. I don't even think I got halfway through. Tails has this weird mechanic with this ring that he can throw or use to pick up items. I really can't figure out how to work this game. I kept dying to a door. Eventually I had enough, and I just kind of watched the continue screen count me down to a game over and then smiled about it. Here's another game that's just about Tails, but this one we actually got in the US, and despite it being a platformer of sorts, it's not a platformer akin to the other games in the Sonic series. This one is more of an exploratory puzzle platformer. I also can't figure out what it's actually called because the title screen says Tails Adventures, but the box and the cartridge say Tails Adventure. Okay. So you obtain items to add to your arsenal that get you past certain roadblocks, and you need to use critical thinking to figure out how to effectively use the new items you get as you get them. It's pretty interesting as a concept, but it's not something I'd really call a great game. The gameplay is pretty slow, and it's easy to get attacked by enemies since there's no great platforming mechanics here. It kind of feels like they made enemies for a traditional platformer and then threw them into a slow-paced exploratory game. I didn't get very far because I got bored with it, but I think it's an adequate enough game. If nothing else, it's an interesting change of pace. Sonic Labyrinth is a weird isometric game in the same vein as something like Sonic 3D Blast. Much like Sonic 3D Blast, it's about traversing pretty small isometric stages to collect a certain amount of items to progress to the next stage. In this game's case, you have to collect 3 keys that can be found either just lying around somewhere or being held by enemies that you need to defeat to progress. Controlling Sonic isn't fun. He walks at a snail's pace and can't run at all, so the only way to effectively get around is to spin dash everywhere, which conveniently isn't at all easy to they control. I've heard a lot of people make fun of this game over the years, and it's been the butt of many jokes I've heard in the past, but now playing it for myself, I can't say this is the worst thing I've ever played. It's definitely one of the better Sonic titles on the Game Gear at least. Then again, I'm one of those weird people that like Sonic 3D Blast. I didn't finish this one, but I got pretty close. This was okay. It would be 10,000 times better though if Sonic could at least, I don't know, jog. Okay. This is the first official Sonic game that I can say with absolute full confidence looks like a straight-up bootleg. You know the kind. The ones that are always called something ridiculous, like Super Sonic World Adventureland 7. Well, you can finally play as Knuckles, if that means anything to you. Unfortunately, the only platformer for the Game Gear that you can play as Knuckles in is straight-up garbage. Everything was for some reason given a pre-rendered aesthetic like in Donkey Kong Country, but it all looks, well, look. Your character sprite takes up half the stupid screen, there's almost zero sprite animations, there's pretty much no background elements. Coconuts is all cracked out on crack, and most of the stage assets are just completely unpolished. I don't know what this was supposed to be, but it controls bad, the level design is bad and extremely cheap in a lot of places, and the art design, if you can even call it that, had an unapologetically laughable amount of effort put into it. I don't know how anyone can look at this for even 2 seconds and say confidently that anybody genuinely tried here. And this is also the last first-party Game Gear title to release in North America. What a way to go out. I wish I could say Sonic had a good run on the Game Gear like many feel he had on the Genesis, but unfortunately, it just isn't the case. There's a few gems in here for sure, but the bulk of it is, well, a flaming pile of poop. And it can't be chalked up to a limitation of the hardware, because Sonic Chaos and Sonic 1 show us that the Game Gear was clearly capable of housing a decent Sonic game. Oh well, at least go play those two. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you like it and want to see more, lucky you, because there's a couple other videos you can watch right there. And if you want to keep up with everything I release, subscribe and then tap the bell icon, because YouTube said so. I also have a Patreon right there if you want to help support the channel.